Claire had been holding it together as best she could, but the weight of everything in Genoa City finally pushed her past her breaking point. From the moment she returned to her family's orbit, she carried with her a fragile hope that maybe this place, these people, could finally give her a sense of belonging she never truly had. But every hallway whispered with secrets, every smile masked a hidden agenda, and every promise felt like it could shatter at any second. She tried to convince herself that Kyle's support would be enough, that his hand in hers could silence the doubts echoing inside her. Yet as the days unfolded, Kyle himself seemed to be unraveling, his darker impulses surfacing more often, until she barely recognized the man who had once looked at her with such warmth. The shadow of Holden, the rival who always seemed to be in the middle of their fights, hovered over them like a storm cloud. And one night, as Kyle's jaw clenched and his eyes darkened, Claire realized she wasn't safe, not from Holden, not from the lies, and not from Kyle's growing rage. She packed quietly, almost mechanically, not daring to let herself cry too much as she folded the clothes she had once worn proudly as if they symbolized a fresh start. The creak of the dresser drawer made her freeze, as though even the house was conspiring to keep her here, but she pressed on, knowing if she didn't leave now, she never would. Her heart broke in silence because she knew what leaving meant, giving up on the fantasy she had built in her mind, walking away from the possibility of love with Kyle, and perhaps most painfully, turning her back on the family who had just begun to accept her. But she couldn't pretend anymore. Every time Kyle's voice rose or his hand slammed against a table, she saw flashes of a man teetering on the edge. And though she wanted to believe love could save him, she also knew love could just as easily destroy her. Kyle didn't take her departure quietly. He found her at the Abbott estate, suitcase in hand, tears streaming down her face, and in that moment, the world inside him collapsed. He wasn't ready to lose her. Not after everything. His words came out sharp, desperate, a mixture of love and fury that made Claire shrink back even as her heart cried for him. He demanded to know if Holden was behind this, if that snake had whispered doubts into her ear, poisoning her against him. Claire shook her head, whispering that it wasn't about Holden, it was about survival, hers and his. But Kyle wasn't listening. He saw only betrayal, only abandonment, and in the corners of his mind, the thought began to take root that maybe Holden was the obstacle standing between him and everything he wanted. If Holden were gone, if his influence were erased, maybe Claire would see him again, not as the man she feared but as the man she once loved. The dangerous spiral was slow at first, masked by his attempts to keep up appearances. To the Abbotts, Kyle looked like a man grappling with heartbreak, throwing himself into work, numbing his pain with long hours and tense conversations with Jack. But behind the scenes, his thoughts grew darker with every passing day. Holden's name was never far from his lips, muttered in frustration when he thought no one could hear, scrawled in notes that ended up ripped to shreds in his wastebasket. His obsession wasn't just about Claire anymore, it became about control, about proving he wouldn't be outplayed or humiliated. Genoa City had seen Kyle as a golden boy for so long, the charming son of Jack Abbott, the heir with the world at his feet. But now that image was cracking, and beneath it, a storm brewed that few could imagine. Meanwhile, Holden wasn't blind to the tension. He knew Kyle blamed him for Claire's departure, and in truth, he hadn't discouraged it. Holden thrived in chaos, feeding off the fractures in other people's lives to make himself look stronger. The rivalry between them escalated subtly at first, pointed comments in public, veiled threats in private, silent stares that carried more weight than any spoken words. But soon, everyone around them could feel it. At society, when their paths crossed, even the clinking of glasses and hum of background chatter couldn't disguise the electricity sparking between them. And when Kyle's hand balled into a fist one evening as Holden smirked across the room, Summer herself had to step in, whispering in Kyle's ear to calm down before he made a scene. But calming down wasn't something Kyle could do anymore. The rage that had once simmered quietly now boiled over with every interaction. He replayed Claire's voice in his head, the way she had pleaded with him not to lose himself, and it only fueled his bitterness. He told himself he wasn't the villain here, that Holden was the real problem, the manipulator who thrived off others' pain. If Holden disappeared, Genoa City would breathe easier, and Claire, yes, Claire would finally come back. The thought twisted into an obsession, and soon Kyle wasn't just imagining arguments with Holden, he was imagining ways to end them permanently. The question wasn't whether Kyle was capable of violence, it was whether he would allow himself to cross that line. In his darkest moments, pacing his office late at night or sitting in his car outside Holden's apartment, he felt the possibility creeping closer. He justified it in small steps. Hadn't Victor Newman done worse in the name of protecting family? Hadn't Jack himself taken ruthless steps when necessary? Maybe the Abbotts weren't strangers to darkness, and maybe Kyle was simply claiming his own inheritance. But even as those thoughts settled, another voice fought inside him, Claire's voice, whispering his name with love, begging him not to destroy himself. And yet, that voice grew fainter with every sleepless night, drowned out by the roar of anger building in his chest. When the inevitable confrontation came, it was almost cinematic in its intensity. Holden cornered Kyle at the club after too many drinks, leaning in close with that infuriating smirk, taunting him about Claire, about being abandoned, about always being second best. The words were knives, each one slicing deeper than the last, and for a moment Kyle saw red. His hand shot out, grabbing Holden by the collar, slamming him against the wall with a force that turned heads across the room. Gasps echoed, voices rose, but all Kyle could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the sickeningly calm tone of Holden daring him to go further. That was the moment, the line, the choice, the crossroads. And though Summer and Chance and others rushed in to pull them apart, everyone watching knew something irreversible had shifted. Kyle wasn't just Jack's son anymore. He was a man teetering on the edge of a path that could cost him everything. Claire heard about the fight the next morning, and her heart shattered all over again. She wanted to run back to him, to hold him, to remind him of who he really was, but the fear gnawed at her more deeply than ever. If Kyle could let himself go that far, what would stop him the next time? And what if the next time wasn't just a fight in public but something darker, something fatal? She wept into her pillow, torn between love and survival, guilt and self-preservation. She knew Holden played his games, knew he provoked Kyle, but Kyle's choice to take the bait revealed the darkness lurking inside him. And though she hated herself for it, she couldn't help but wonder, was Kyle destined to become the very monster he claimed to despise? The intricate tapestry of the young and the restless is woven with threads of familial legacy, romantic entanglements, and the perpetual struggle between the light and darkness inherent in every individual. A current narrative thread, pulsating with a particularly potent energy, involves the departure of Claire Grace and the subsequent, potentially seismic, impact it may have on Kyle Abbott. This development is not merely a plot point concerning two characters, it is a catalyst that threatens to unravel the carefully constructed facade of one of Genoa City's most prominent scions, pushing him toward a precipice from which there may be no return. The question hanging ominously in the air is not simply about Kyle's mood or his next business move, but something far more profound: is Kyle's descent into a dark path now an inevitability? This potential transformation is further complicated and charged by the shocking, almost unthinkable, directive from his father, Jack Abbott, to kill the presumed dead but ever-present specter of John J.T. Hellstrom, a command that echoes with the weight of history and the desperation of the present moment. To fully comprehend the gravity of Claire's exit and its effect on Kyle, one must first understand the unique and profound connection they forged. Both are, in their own ways, children of immense trauma and manipulation, products of a vicious cycle of revenge orchestrated by Jordan. Kyle was a pawn in the game long before Claire arrived, his life and his marriage to Summer hollowed out by the machinations of Victor Newman and his own father's compromises, all of which were exploited by Jordan through her proxy, Harrison's nanny, Eve. Claire, of course, was Jordan's primary project, weaponized from birth against the Newman family she was never allowed to know. When their shared victimhood at the hands of the same tormentor was revealed, it created a bond that transcended typical Genoa City alliances. They were not just allies, they were mirrors for one another, living proof that survival and perhaps even redemption were possible. In each other, they found a sanctuary of understanding that no one else in their orbits, not even their well-meaning families, could possibly provide. Kyle became Claire's most steadfast defender, seeing the wounded person beneath the villainous actions. In turn, Claire's gradual acceptance into the family and her genuine efforts toward atonement validated Kyle's own struggles and his belief in second chances. Her decision to leave Genoa City, therefore, is not a simple goodbye. For Kyle, it is the removal of a foundational pillar of his recent stability. It is the loss of his confidant, the one person who truly understood the depth of the psychological wreckage Jordan left in her wake without him needing to explain it. With Claire gone, that specific, hard-won empathy vanishes. He is left once again surrounded by people who love him but who are also inextricably linked to the power structures and familial expectations that have often been a source of his pain: the Abbott legacy, the Newman rivalry, the perpetual shadow of his parents' choices. This isolation is the fertile ground in which resentment and darkness can take root. Kyle has always possessed a streak of impulsivity and a capacity for ruthlessness, often inherited from his mother but tempered by the Abbott idealism of his father. Without Claire's calming, understanding presence, that tempering agent is gone. The equilibrium he had painstakingly built is shattered, leaving him emotionally raw and vulnerable to his baser instincts. This vulnerability arrives at the most inopportune moment, coinciding with a crisis of apocalyptic proportions for the Abbott family: the kidnapping of Harrison by Jordan. This event is the trigger that launches the narrative into its most intense phase and directly leads to the moment that could define Kyle's future. The Abbott family, led by Jack, is thrust into a primal struggle for survival. The command to kill Holden is not delivered in a vacuum. It is a desperate, father's order born of utter powerlessness and ferocious love for his grandson. Holden is the identity Jordan has forced upon the captive J.T. Hellstrom, a man broken and remade into a tool of her vengeance. To Jack, in that moment of extreme duress, Holden is not a person, he is the embodiment of the threat to Harrison, an obstacle standing between his family and salvation. The directive is shocking precisely because it comes from Jack Abbott, the moral compass of the family, a man defined by his principle and his heart. His breakdown and this order signify that all normal rules have been suspended. We are in the territory of raw, visceral survival. For Kyle, receiving this order is the ultimate test and a potential point of no return. He is already in an emotionally heightened state, fueled by fear for his son, rage at Jordan, and the fresh wound of Claire's departure. Jack's words are not just a strategy, they are a permission slip to unleash the very darkness that Kyle has been fighting to keep contained. The question of whether he will literally kill the man is almost secondary to the psychological impact of being asked to do so by his idolized father. It forces Kyle to confront a violent potential within himself that he may not have known existed, or has long suppressed. To be told by Jack Abbott that the only way is murder fundamentally shatters Kyle's worldview. The Abbott mantra of family first is being twisted into its most extreme and horrific form. Is this what it truly means to be an Abbott? To protect your own at any cost, even the cost of your own soul? This philosophical crisis is the engine of his potential dark path. The inevitability of Kyle's descent hinges on his interpretation of this moment and his subsequent actions. If he carries out the act, or even seriously attempts to, there will be no coming back. He will be a murderer, forever marked by that singular choice. The guilt, the trauma, and the secret would corrode him from the inside out, transforming him into a permanently cynical and hardened figure, a far cry from the hopeful young man who once ran Jabot. Even if he stops short of killing, the mere fact that he seriously considered it, that he was willing to cross that line, will leave a permanent stain on his psyche. The darkness is not necessarily in the deed itself, but in the acceptance of the deed as a viable option. Claire's absence is keenly felt here. She is perhaps the only one who could have understood the impossible pressure he was under without immediately condemning him. Her own history with extreme actions might have allowed her to reach him, to offer a perspective that wasn't purely moralistic but was born of hard experience. Without her, Kyle's internal dialogue is dominated by fear, rage, and a twisted sense of filial duty. Furthermore, this situation forces a brutal reevaluation of legacy. Kyle has spent his life navigating the complicated inheritance of being both an Abbott and a Newman by blood. He has witnessed the ruthless, often cruel, tactics of his grandfather Victor and the more principled, though sometimes flawed, leadership of his father Jack. He has struggled to find his own path between these two poles. Now, in his darkest hour, it is Jack who has voiced a solution that feels more in line with Victor's world, a world where enemies are eliminated, and morality is a luxury. If Kyle follows through, he will have chosen, however reluctantly, the Newman path of ruthless expediency over the Abbott path of righteous integrity. He would become the embodiment of his worst fears about himself, fulfilling a destiny he has long fought against. The tragedy would be that he did it not for personal gain, but out of a distorted sense of love for his son and obedience to his father, making the psychological fallout even more complex and devastating. The aftermath, regardless of the outcome, will redefine every relationship in his life. His relationship with Jack will be forever altered. Can he look at his father the same way after being given such a command? Will there be resentment, or a terrible, shared bond of a horrific secret? His relationship with his mother, Diane, will be tested. Diane, who has her own checkered past but who has fought for redemption, would be horrified, potentially creating a new rift. Most importantly, his co-parenting relationship with Summer will be irrevocably broken. If he becomes a killer, or even a man capable of killing, Summer will rightly fight to keep Harrison away from him. The very act meant to save his son could result in the permanent loss of him. And what of himself? The man Kyle Abbott believes himself to be will die in that cabin, replaced by a stranger shaped by trauma and a single, irrevocable choice. Therefore, Claire's departure acts as the critical destabilizing factor that makes Kyle uniquely susceptible to this dark turn. It isolated him emotionally at the precise moment he needed unwavering, unbiased support. Jack's command is the catalyst that provides a direction and a terrible purpose for his swirling negative emotions. The combination is volatile and dangerous. Is his dark path inevitable? In storytelling, few things are truly inevitable until they are written. However, the narrative has been meticulously constructed to make it a terrifyingly plausible outcome. The pieces are all in place: the emotional vulnerability, the primal fear for a child, the shocking moral compromise of a beloved parent, and the absence of the one person who could have served as a grounding influence. Kyle stands on the edge, looking into an abyss that promises a solution through violence. Whether he steps over that edge will determine not just the immediate fate of Holden, but the entire trajectory of his character. The true tragedy is that this potential fall from grace is not born of malice, but of a perfect storm of love, fear, and desperation, making Kyle Abbott one of the most tragically poised figures in Genoa City, a man whose soul is the final battleground in his family's war for survival.